Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to unpack the ancient city of Corinth, but not just as some dry historical event. We're looking at it as an absolute masterclass in global mission strategy. Often when we read the letters to the Corinthians, we just see this laundry list of really messy church problems, right? Rampant dysfunction, arguments, moral failures. But today, we're viewing this through a purely missiological lens. We're going to analyze exactly how the Apostle Paul operated in what was arguably one of the most challenging, distracting, and pluralistic environments of the ancient world. And more importantly, what his calculated actions teach us about planning and sustaining a mission in deeply complex cultures.
Here's our strategic briefing for today. We've got 5 phases to cover. 1. The missionary identity. 2. Targeting strategic Corinth. 3. Paul's mission strategy. 4. Overcoming hostile opposition. And 5. Pastoring from afar.
All right, let's jump right into phase 1, the missionary identity. This is all about knowing exactly who you are before you deploy.
This entire missiological blueprint really kicks off with one specific foundational Greek word, apostolos. Now, outside the New Testament, this was actually kind of a rare word. It was mostly used in naval or military contexts to describe a dispatched fleet or a specially commissioned commander. So by claiming this title of an envoy, a messenger, or one who is sent, Paul is immediately declaring that his purpose isn't self-directed. He's not just some religious tourist wandering around the Mediterranean. He is on a strict divine deployment, and that establishes a core, unshakable identity right out of the gate.
See, Paul wasn't just resting on his impressive resume. He wasn't relying on his education at the feet of famous scholars or his prestigious past as an elite Pharisee. Honestly, if he had relied on that stuff, the culture of Corinth would have eaten him alive. Instead, his identity was deeply anchored in his divine call. He traced his authority directly back to his own personal encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. He knew he was called by the will of God, commissioned to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, and validated by the actual tangible fruit of his ministry, meaning real new churches and new converts. Having that crystal clear identity is what ensured he wouldn't completely lose his way in the wildly complex environment he was walking into.
Moving on to phase 2, targeting strategic Corinth, choosing your target demographic and location. Okay. So Corinth was essentially the Las Vegas and Wall Street of the ancient Mediterranean, just rolled into one crazy city. On one hand, it offered immense logistic advantages for a missionary. It had 2 major harbors, making it an absolute economic powerhouse and the political capital of Achaia. Because it was a rebuilt Roman colony, it was uniquely open to upward social mobility and fresh new ideas. But wow, talk about steep obstacles. You had this blatant religious cacophony with heavily funded shrines to Apollo, Athena, Egyptian gods like Isis. The ancient historian Strabo even noted there were a staggering 1,000 sacred prostitutes dedicated to the temple of Aphrodite. It was an environment of just extreme moral corruption, defined by flagrant idolatry and an absolute obsession with wealth.
So you gotta ask yourself, when you evaluate the cutthroat commercial ambition, that massive exchange of ideas, and the deep moral complexities of ancient Corinth, it really acts as a perfect modern parallel to the bustling, pluralistic global cities we live and work in today, doesn't it? It begs a fascinating question. If Paul could strategically navigate and disrupt the intense noise of a city like Corinth, what exact tactics can we replicate for our own modern communities?
That brings us to phase 3, Paul's mission strategy. Let's look at the actual tactical execution on the ground.
His on-the-ground methodology was seriously a masterclass in phased execution. First up, self-sustainability. Well, actually, more like financial independence through manual labor. He partnered with Aquila and Priscilla and worked as a tent maker. Why is that so crucial? Because in ancient Roman culture, taking money meant becoming a client to a wealthy patron. You owed them favors. Paul wanted his message to remain completely uncompromised by any Corinthian power brokers. Second, he engaged familiar ground. He went straight to the synagogue first to reason from the scriptures. But when intense conflicts inevitably blew up, he didn't just pack his bags. He executed step 3, a deliberate pivot to a receptive demographic. He shifted his focus to the God-fearing Gentiles who already resonated with Jewish morals. He literally moved his operation next door to the house of Titius Justus. And that brilliantly led to the conversion of Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and a bunch of others.
Now, amidst all the philosophical and religious noise of the city, Paul made a crucial tactical decision about his messaging. Remember, he had just come from Athens, where he famously used all these elaborate intellectual arguments to engage the thinkers at the Areopagus. But in Corinth, a city entirely obsessed with status, eloquence, and flashing wealth, he deliberately shifted tactics. He determined to know absolutely nothing among them except one singular, radically countercultural solution: Jesus Christ and Him crucified. By focusing entirely on a crucified Savior, he actively stripped away any reliance on human wisdom or societal status. He just kept the main thing, the main thing.
Which leads us to phase 4, overcoming hostile opposition. Because let's face it, what do you do when the mission hits a total brick wall?
The local resistance here was absolutely fierce. As Paul pushed forward, he faced intense hostility. The source text notes that his opponents blasphemed. And when you apply that Greek verb to a human being, it means to revile or defame. In an ancient honor and shame culture, that is incredibly significant. This was no polite theological debate. It was a highly organized, targeted attack aimed at completely ruining Paul's public reputation to suffocate his missionary momentum. If you lose your honor in Corinth, man, you lose your voice. It was a terrifying position to be in. Paul frankly admits in his own letters that he was in Corinth in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling.
Right when the mission was on the absolute brink of failure, and he was probably contemplating packing up for an easier field. He'd already had to flee cities like Berea and Thessalonica. God intervened. Christ appeared to him in this powerful midnight vision with a mandate echoing the ancient prophets. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you. This was the ultimate turning point. God assured him that despite the outward hostility, the harvest in this dark city was going to be massive. He wasn't alone, and his physical safety was guaranteed.
18. Re-energized by that divine mandate, Paul dug his heels in for a solid 18 months. Now, in the context of Paul's usual rapid-fire missionary journeys, that is a massive investment of time. He made Corinth his headquarters, and from that sustained, stubborn effort, amidst all that vicious opposition, multiple new house churches were successfully planted and established throughout the whole region.
Finally, we hit phase 5. Pastoring from afar. How do you sustain the mission and ensure follow-up once you've eventually left?
Paul's eventual physical absence was supplemented by these weighty, incredibly powerful letters. Honestly, think of these as pastoral triage. While he was over in Ephesus, he received a highly troubling report from Chloe's household, plus a letter full of confusing questions from the Corinthians themselves. So he writes 1 Corinthians to address some severe issues tearing them apart. We're talking rampant factionalism, believers literally taking each other to pagan courts over petty disputes, and glaring sexual immorality. Later in 2 Corinthians, he has to vigorously defend his very life and his apostolic ministry against these newly arrived smooth-talking detractors. But throughout all this incredible drama, he continuously points them back to one single standard: the message of the cross.
The real kicker here? These letters addressed a church that was deeply infected by its own zip code. Because most of the congregation lacked a Jewish background, they couldn't be easily identified as a distinct, pre-existing sect. And that lack of clear boundaries created massive internal vulnerabilities. Instead of transforming their city, they just started valuing exactly what the pagan Corinthian culture valued: ruthless competition, power, eloquence, and wealth. It stands as this stark, timeless warning for us. If a missional community doesn't have a firm, distinct grasp on exactly who they are, the surrounding culture is going to gladly step in and define them.
So what was Paul's ultimate solution for their deep dysfunction? It wasn't some complex administrative fix or a new set of bylaws or a leadership reshuffle. To cure the cultural infection, he demanded a return to their true identity in the gospel. He urged them to hold fast to the message of the cross. By evaluating every single behavior, every lawsuit, and every arrogant attitude against the self-sacrificial nature of the gospel, they could forge a Christ-focused culture robust enough to actually withstand the immense pressures of life in Corinth.
So, as you look at your own communities today, how are you going to deploy Paul's blueprint? Will you maintain your distinct identity and strategically adapt to the complexities of your own modern Corinth? Or will you slowly let the surrounding noise dictate your values? True missional success requires anchoring your identity entirely in the message of the cross, no matter the cultural cost. I really want you to think on that as we wrap up today's explainer. Keep learning, stay uncompromised, and keep your focus on the mission. Catch you next time.